Welcome to Goats by Ashley Hoglund and Miranda Workman. Goats are hoofed animals, also known as ungulates. There are 6 wild species of goat. Wild goats can be found throughout Asia and the Mediterranean basin. They are a very adaptive species that are found on various terrains ranging from desert to the Arctic. Over 10,000 years ago, the first species of goat was thought to have been domesticated. Therefore, our domestic goats stem from a common ancestor named the bezoar goat. Domestic goats became utilized for their milk, meat, skin, and even their dung. Wild and domestic goats are very sociable and live in matrifocal groups where the females and their offspring live together. The males are generally separate from the female group, but remain in the same general territory. Wild goats remain in a habitat suitable for escape in case a predator arrives. Domestic goats are normally kept in paddocks. Female goats display agonistic behavior when general resources are in low supply. Males fight, on the other hand, and much more commonly, and are generally seen between males with the same size horns. Goats will eat a variety of food, but they prefer leaves and shoots. Their ability to climb into trees makes it easy to browse. Goats also maintain a minimum daily intake of water. Their reproductive season starts in the autumn, and offspring are generally born in the spring. During mating season, the males compete for females. Some domesticated female goats are even known to enter into an early reproductive season due to the presence of males. Female goats actively groom and manage their young, starting right after birth. A lack of food to the mother has been shown to slow down this type of interaction. At first, their young, known as kids, will remain stationary until the mother signals for them. Later, the young will begin to follow their mothers and the rest of their group. Some concerns for domesticated goats include predation because of the lack of an escape route when housed in a paddock. Other concerns in captivity are temperature fluctuations and lack of food and water for the entire group. Within their housing areas, domestic goats may also sometimes display agonistic behavior during feeding time. One study took a look at the feed barrier design and its effects on the behavior and physiology of goats. Researchers wanted to study which feeding barrier option would reduce the amount of agonistic behavior between goats. This study is important because reducing such behaviors would reduce the risk of injury due to physical altercations. The study looked at 55 adult non-lactating female goats of several Swiss dairy breeds, and they broke them into 2 groups of horned goats and 2 groups of hornless goats. The goats were rotated through 4 different housing areas that were identical except for the feeding barriers. Once groups were placed together, they were allowed 12 days to acclimate to one another, and then data was collected over the next 16 days. The total experiment took 16 weeks. 3 criteria were examined: ability for the goats to have a backward view, allowing them to see who is approaching the feeding station, the ease of leaving the feeding station, and the physical separation between individual feeding areas. One feeding station used a neck rail, which required goats to move their head down in order to move away from the feeding area. This does not provide physical separation of goats at the feeding space, but may allow them to see who is approaching. Another feeding station is the diagonal fence. This requires the goat to twist its head to back away from the feeding space. This is particularly challenging for horned goats. This one does allow the goat to see who is approaching, but requires much more effort to move away if needed. The third feeding station was a wooden palisade, which provides each goat with a separate feeding area, but does not allow them to see who is approaching the feeding station. It is easy to move away if needed. The fourth feeding barrier was the metal palisade, which provides separation for feeding areas, allows individuals to see approaching goats, and allows them to easily move away from the feeding area without any additional twisting or moving of their head. The metal palisade was determined to be the best option for reducing stress and agonistic behaviors in goats at feeding stations. It did find that there was a much more significant change in the non-horned goats. This could be due to the fact that non-horned goats require less space per goat, and therefore the stress is not evenly spread across the entire living space, but typically concentrated at the feeding station. Therefore, eliminating this type of stress makes for a healthier environment and much less risk of injury to each goat.